The first one we have here is, what role do community-based organizations play in advocating for health and safety improvements in mining regions?
Go
I'll
ahead,
just say
Colleen.
that they're central. They're central, and in a lot of these situations that are just so complex and difficult, community-based organizations have shown to be some of the most successful in making really lasting and important changes at community level, advocate for community themselves, to make direction. So, of course, we want to be able to build and sustain power at the community level. So they're central, they're critical to all of this work, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that one of the roles that community organizations play, or NGOs, I think of Caritas in Northwest Province in Zambia, that the role that they play is really helping communities understand how to effectively communicate their opposition, their resistance, or their contribution, whatever it happens to be, to sort of government mining authorities. Otherwise, I mean, often, um, many of us have been in situations where the community is upset about something, um, and the voices of concern kind of come out as being sort of unconstructive. I guess maybe that's a way to put it. Um, and the chaotic and so forth. And what these organizations can do is help communities really help articulate their opposition in more effective ways.
Thank you. Another question we have is, are Indigenous knowledges and practices currently being incorporated into environmental and health impact assessments?
I believe they are. I don't know if other members on the call still can speak to that. I feel like Miguel would be really well positioned to comment on that, but I know he's not on the call anymore. I know they do, but I'm not on the inside of those sort of pieces of research or conversations. Perhaps others know.
I think so. Again, having done most of my work outside of North America, I can only speak to really sort of the context where I've worked. Although I know one of my colleagues who has worked closely with First Nations groups in British Columbia, and I think in that context there was really an effort to incorporate Indigenous concepts into their. I think they were the community-sponsored HIA in that particular context I'm thinking of. So yes, I think so, but again, I don't know in detail.
Another question. Oh, yep, sorry.
I was just going to say, I feel like there are some Indigenous governments and leaders that are very well versed in these processes and have been able to negotiate and assert certain things be added or included in the assessments, but there isn't I wouldn't say that would be the majority of people's stories from what I understand. Sorry, but we can move on.
Thank you.
Maybe just to add one thing. I mean, the one question that comes to mind is that often, these impact assessments are formal documents that are written up and disseminated, and they're ultimately submitted to a government agency, for example, or environmental agency.
Mm-hmm.
The question in my mind is, to what degree do governments, whether it's British Columbia or Nunavut or otherwise, accept accept as legitimate these perspectives? And I think that would be a question that I would want to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Another question here is, what ethical considerations should be taken into account when assessing the health impacts of mining on Indigenous peoples?
Can you say the start of that question again?
What ethical considerations should be taken into account when assessing the health impacts of mining on Indigenous peoples?
I mean, it's somewhat tied to some of the thinking I was starting to have, but I didn't really articulate to the previous question in terms of impact assessments and what might be included in that. So I think historically it's been very focused on physical health, and other elements and dimensions have been added over time. But I really liked what Miguel was saying around the responsibility-based thinking, and so I think some of the ethics are really tied into building enough of a relationship to have honest conversations and respecting Indigenous people's rights and responsibility to the land. So I think there's an inherent ethics behind that, but it's very hard to enforce or even tangibly observe. Like, I don't know how one can really know whether things are being done in an ethical manner, because there's only things that we can see or observe with our own eyes. And thinking about like Indigenous determinants of health, like slightly different from, say, the social determinants of health, sort of the distal or the roots of the well-being of the other expressions of health are very much tied in the ability to self-determine and have some agency. And self-determination often includes making sure that Indigenous peoples are fully informed and able to weigh into what is going to happen. So I feel like the ethics lie in that at that level, but it's very hard to know necessarily what that looks like in each community.
Thank you. Another question is, and some of these questions are very complex, but we'll try our best. How do mining-induced health issues compare in severity between developed and developing countries, and what can be learned from these comparisons?
We're waiting to get Colleen back. I'll jump in and say that, I mean, it's a very interesting question. And in some of the big sort of industrial mining operations that I've seen in places like Mongolia and in Zambia, and also had a student work with a Canadian mining company in South Africa, their CFR initiative. These companies seem to be aware of a couple of things. One is that they need to do something, that they're aware of the limitations of the public sector in terms of providing social, health, and educational services. And so they seem to be kind of willing to kind of step in and invest some resources into doing that. So this has certainly been the case in Northwest Province, Zambia, in the big Trident mine, and in Mongolia as well. And I guess my question maybe to others, and maybe Colleen, you want to jump in here, is whether that same sentiment, or same awareness that, well, government's limited, we've got to do something, we're going to do our best to mitigate some of the impacts of mining that might occur in a place like Zambia, would occur in Canada, where the assumption is that the government needs to provide these services. So anyway, that's one observation.
I apologize for my activity issues, what's happening, but I keep getting kicked out. But
Oh, sorry. You're welcome.
I think we have time for maybe one more. We have one more question here, and then we can close off the symposium a little earlier to respect everyone's time. But this final question, and it is a larger question as well, but and some of it was touched on already. But what role do governmental policies and regulations play in managing health risks associated with mining, and how can they be strengthened? And then I'm thinking, if you're going beyond the question, I mean, this could be in the Canadian context, but also globally, because I know Dr. James was talking about Zambia and South Africa and Mongolia. So feel free to keep it within the Canadian context or to go beyond that.
I apologize for my connectivity issues. Hopefully I'll be able to stay on. I've hotspotted myself. think the community, government, and corporation or mining company or the conglomerate of business are the three in the triangle, right? And if we take out any of them, we're not seeing a lot of positive change that's sustainable, that's a good structure for, future health and community health. So if we're lacking the government structures, that's a problem. If the corporations are not following international protocols, if they don't have their own accountability or IBAs or other things, that's a problem. And then, the community itself, there's a role to play as well. So I think that it's that sort of triad of cooperation, and we can continue to work in all of those areas.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, the regulatory framework is important, but it's not the only thing. In and of itself, it's probably insufficient without strong, I think, strong support from communities. And this, to go back to an earlier question, support that can be bolstered by the activity of community-based organizations, NGOs, and that sort of thing. Make sure that the community has a strong voice that ensures that regulation, whatever they are in fact affected. We were able to, in Mongolia, change the environmental impact assessment law to include health and to bring together sort of the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Health to articulate some sort of regulations and that sort of thing. But the degree to which these are actually enforced, I think, in my mind, is a question that ultimately is up to other constituents, in addition to government, to ensure that they're being enforced.